In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the first European settlements in North America, in today what is Canada, and we're going to talk about those particularly focused on New France, so the French settlements in North America. In last lesson, we left off with Samuel de Champlain founding Quebec in 1608. Now, by the mid 1600s, there were three main European countries that had set up colonies in the Americas. And the three big ones were Britain, also known as England at that time, had established colonies. And again, colonies are kind of like mini countries that are owned by another country along the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States and the Atlantic provinces. They also had trading posts near Hudson's Bay. France had established colonies in what is now Quebec and the Atlantic provinces of Canada. So that's like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. And Spain had established colonies in Florida and Mexico. So you can fill these blanks in on your notes, and then and you can pause for a moment to do that. And then we're gonna go down and we're gonna fill in this map here. So this is a map of most of Eastern North America, and it's not the most beautiful map. We're gonna fill it in with some labeling of where the different sections are, where the different colonies and the different European powers have started setting up colonies in the middle of the 1600s. So I'm going to start with the French. So I'm going to label them blue, and I'm going to go over here to where there's a map key, and I'd like you to write on your map, French is blue. You can do that. Now the French were mostly concentrated in the mid 1600s here around the St. Lawrence River. Around this area, the St. Lawrence River, this was kind of the main area that they had their colonies and their possessions. They had some colonies and possessions also in what is now New Brunswick. So this kind of area up here would have been New France, and it kind of stretched all the way down. But this would have been the area that New France was. So here in what is today Canada, they had a little bit down here actually in the Caribbean as well. Now the British, I'm going to color them in red. In the British colonies, they had a little bit here in what's today Halifax, a little bit in Newfoundland, and then a few kind of around parts of Hudson's Bay. But the main kind of area that their colonies were in today what is the northern United States and then the southern United States as well, kind of along the coast. And so that is where the British set up their colonies at this point, all along the coast of what is today the eastern part of the US, along the Atlantic coast. You got to remember at this point, there are no European powers over on the Pacific side because it's so much further away from Europe than the Atlantic side is. So I'm going to color that in red for the British. And I'm going to do one final one for the Spanish. The Spanish don't come up in Canadian history very much because they were much more present in the southern part of the Americas. But I think it's worth kind of noting. So the Spanish, I'm going to color them green. And they had some colonies kind of spread throughout Florida and then all the way down in Mexico. And they had a big empire called New Spain down there. So I'm going to color that in green. It's probably easier for you guys to color with pencil crayons than it is with my cursor here. They had set up colonies all throughout Cuba. And so this would have been kind of what things look like and in terms of European colonies in North America at this time. Now, the thing to remember, of course, is that this entire continent is already inhabited by indigenous people, right? And so the vast majority of the people who live here are the indigenous people, and the Europeans are just starting to get kind of a foothold. The Spanish had a much bigger one than the French did or the English did, but they're starting to kind of expand their colonies, and the indigenous people are having to react to these changes. So if you need to pause to take a few more minutes to color in these locations, it might be worth labeling that this is called New France, this is called New England, this is called New Spain. But let's go on and talk a little bit more about New France. So this is a colony that Samuel de Champlain founded in 1608, and it's in what is today Quebec, and it extends into parts of New Brunswick, parts of Nova Scotia, and down into the eastern part of what's today Ontario. So the area around Quebec is known as New France. So it's known as New France. And its economy, so that means what people are doing, is mainly based on the two words for what it's mainly based on, shown up here in this image. Two words for what it's mainly based on. Yeah, I think you guys know it. It is the fur trade. It's mainly based on the fur trade. It's mainly based on the fur trade and also on farming. So the fur trade is where the voyageurs, they go further up the St. Lawrence into lakes and various things, and they go there, and what they're doing is they're trading for European manufactured goods like pots and pans and guns and glass and that sort of thing, and they're trading that for furs, which the indigenous people have. And also on farming. The St. Lawrence River Valley is very fertile soil, and people would set up farms there. People would come over from France to set up farms. And one thing to know is that in New France, the original people who came here, the French people who came here, had to cooperate with the original inhabitants. They had to cooperate with the native people who were here. So I'm going to show you this Heritage Minute from Historica Canada that kind of shows an example of that cooperation and that learning from Indigenous people that the French had to do.
Wait. It's a ceremony?
And your Majesty may be pleased to know that this year, thanks to the help of our Indian friends, we have produced some 30,000 pounds of this sweet gift.
And so you can see here how kind of the original inhabitants of this land, so the original people who were here, they knew things that the French did not know. They knew how to make maple syrup by taking the sap of a maple tree and then boiling it to make that sugar. And so that meant that the French didn't have to get sugar from sugarcane, which came up from the Caribbean, that they could produce sugar just in Canada, which is something they learned from the native people and enabled them to farm and to have a successful colony. Now, while they were also doing that farming and setting up farms in New France, another thing that was going on was still the fur trade. And there were explorers setting out from New France in canoes with native guides to go further west to continue this fur trade, but also continue the dream of finding that thing that the French and the English wanted to find. They wanted to find a pathway, not just to settle in Canada. What they wanted to do was find a path, a passage, a northwest passage to enable them to get from Europe through the Americas all the way to Asia. And they thought they might be able to, because of course they were exploring and they didn't know what was there. And so these fur traders would trade for furs, but the whole time they were also looking for something else. And here's an example of a Frenchman who was looking for this Northwest Passage while he traded for furs.
Monsieur de Champlain, when I finish paddling through this wilderness and reach China, I shall greet them wearing this.
Monsieur Nicolet, your mission shall be for the honor of the king and the holy faith.
In the summer of 1634, Jean Nicolet set off from Quebec to find a trade route that would link Europe and North America with China.
Where is it? Further, I know the place you are seeking.
For months, Nicolet pushed through the wilderness, searching for the Western Sea.
Georgia! Mississippi!
What did he say?
He says, Mississippi, great water.
Mississippi, the sea, China.
Jean Nicolet was wrong. It was Lake Michigan, not the Pacific. But others would follow his dream. Joliet, La Salle, the La Vérendryes, and they would map most of North America from the Rockies to the Gulf of Mexico.
And so there is another example of how these fur traders, they kept kind of exploring and they kept opening up more and more and more of this continent. And along the way, they were sometimes hoping to find a way to the Pacific. And of course, in this case, he gets to the Great Lakes. And the Great Lakes are so big that to somebody who didn't know what they were, he was like, oh, this might be the ocean that'll take us all the way to the other, that will take us all the way to Asia. Of course, that wasn't it. We know that there's a lot more land between the Great Lakes and the Pacific. But at the time, they were exploring, so they wouldn't have known that. So again, the economy mostly based on fur trade and farming. That's what people did in New France at that time. And that, I want to tell you a few stories about kind of what life was like in New France that I think give you a cool sense of that. So one of the basic problems with life in New France was that there were just not enough women. Now, the reason there weren't enough women is because if you think about sailors and soldiers and fur traders, most of those jobs involve primarily men. But the problem with having a colony where 9 out of 10 people is a man is that it's really hard to have babies with just a group of men. In fact, it's impossible. So the King of France, he started to pay to send poor women from France, primarily orphans, to settle in Quebec and then marry farmers and traders. And his idea was this, which was that in France at the time, the custom was that when a woman got married, her family would give a gift of cash called a dowry, or sometimes of animals or property, to the family of the husband. And the idea was that by giving this kind of wedding gift, this dowry, the bride's family would be setting up the new family, the husband and the wife, to kind of get a start in life. But the trouble is that if you're an orphan, you don't have a family to give a gift to this husband. And so orphan women, when they turned 18 or older and they wanted to get married, they had a really tough time getting married. So anyways, the King of France says, I will step in and I will pay a dowry. I will pay this cash so that any of these orphan women can go to New France, marry one of the voyageurs, marry one of the farmers, marry one of the soldiers, and then they can settle, they can have a big family, and we can populate that new colony. And so these women were called les filles du roi, the daughters of the king, and they were sent over from France to Quebec. And when they got there, as you can see, they would kind of be there with like a priest, and there would often be nuns and other people helping them to kind of interview eligible bachelors and decide which one would be a good match. And then when they found a good match, they would basically marry them like that, and then they would go off and they would start a family and start a farm and continue the community. So this is kind of a story of some of the very first kind of immigration of people who built French Canada. And almost any person who's got a French background in Canada today can trace their great, 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 great grandmother to one of these women, one of these poor women from France, one of these les filles du roi, the daughters of the king. And they were instrumental. They were a big part of building what became New France. Now, another thing about New France was that the main religion was Catholic, almost exclusively. Everybody was Catholic, and everyone spoke French. And the big thing about that is that these Catholic women, these nuns who came over, they were the ones who started the first schools and the first hospitals in New France and in what is today Canada. I think sometimes when we think about our history, you hear names like Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain and Christopher Columbus and Henry Hudson. And we think often of the names of explorers and military leaders and prime ministers and politicians and kings. And we forget the fact that all the way through our history, a lot of the most important things that make our lives worth living were not built by men, but built by women. And in this case, they were built by women who were nuns, who were committed their life to the Catholic Church, and they took a vow of poverty, to be poor forever, celibacy, to not marry, and obedience, to obey the commands of their superiors. And these women would come over to this new colony, and they started up schools and hospitals. And in fact, there's one of the first hospitals set up in New France was called Hôtel Dieu, which means the Hotel of God. And it was founded by a French Catholic woman named Jeanne Mance in Montreal. And if you go to Montreal today, that's still one of the big hospitals, Hôtel Dieu in Montreal. So these women were really instrumental in starting off the colony. And people were Catholic. Pretty much everyone in that colony would have been baptized and go to church and all that sort of thing. Now, on that topic, I kind of want to tell you a story that I think gives a picture of what life in New France was like, and particularly the connection between New France and the indigenous people. So you have Saint Jean de Brébeuf, and Saint Jean de Brébeuf is kind of an interesting guy because he is a Jesuit priest. So he's a priest from France, And when he's becoming a priest, what they notice is that he's really good at languages. He's really good at learning new languages. So they say, okay, well, you know what we'll do is we'll send him over to the colonies in New France, and then he can go out into the wilderness and meet with these native peoples and try to, convert them to Christianity. And so that's what happens. He gets sent over to New France. He spends a few months kind of getting used to it. And then he goes in a canoe all the way from up here in Quebec. He goes all the way from up here in Quebec, and maybe I'll draw out the map. Up here around Quebec City, and he goes down the St. Lawrence, through Lake Ontario, to around here. And this whole zone that I'm going to circle in green is an area where a native people called the Huron live. Now, the Huron were a native people that were very rich, and they were very kind of well off, and they had farms. They farmed corn, and they farmed beans, and they farmed squash, and they lived in villages. And when Brebeuf got there, and the other thing is that they did a lot of fur trading with the French. So they really, had a connection with the French. They had an alliance with the French, and they would trade furs with the French. And as they did that, they were willing to host these people that they thought were very strange, these strange men who came over with these interesting stories, who wore all black. They were willing to accept them and to have them live in their communities, even if they thought they were strange. So he was a Jesuit priest who went to live among the Huron or Wendat people of what is now Southern Ontario. Now, at first, he was scared of the Huron and their way of life. For a European person to go into one of these communities and to live with them, I think at first he was like, gosh, the food is different, the customs are different, the language is different, I'm uncomfortable, I don't get it, I don't understand it. And the French typically thought that they were in many ways superior and more civilized than the indigenous people. But the longer that Jean lived among them, he learned their language, he learned their culture, and he kind of grew to respect and even admire the indigenous people with whom he lived. And one of the cool things that he did was that he learned their entire language, and he was able to start writing it out, which had never been a thing before. He would write it out in order to compose stories and songs and start to translate the Bible into their Wendat language. And some people in the community liked him and thought that he was, and liked what he had to say. Indigenous people had always believed in the Creator. And so they thought, oh, okay, well, this is just like an addition. This is just a bit more about the Creator. It doesn't go against their beliefs. It doesn't contradict them. It just kind of adds to them. Whereas other people said, oh, this guy's a strange man with strange stories and strange ideas, and we don't, we're definitely not going to become Catholic. In fact, one of the names for him and the other priests that went down there was a crow. And that's because they wear entirely black. And so people would say, oh, the crows. And by that, they meant the priests. Now, one of his accomplishments was that he translated, or not translated, he created this first Christmas carol, which was written in Wendat in the language of the Huron people. And I'm just going to play you a segment from it to kind of show you this connection between Indigenous people and Jean de Brebeuf.
Jesus Satonya, Jesus Satonya, Estenya Hyamde Tanwe Jesus Satonya, Anna wa Tewa Duki Nanwanda Swanenta, Nonsense for 3 hotat non handi rashata, Jesus Satonya.
So you can see what he's done here is he's taking the Christmas story and he's putting it into a language and with symbols and information that people who didn't know anything about Israel or the Middle East or deserts and that kind of thing would understand. And he's using, for example, here the word Gichimanatu, which is the word in the language that the Huron would have spoken for God or the Creator, the Great Spirit. And instead of shepherds, because there weren't any sheep in Canada, he says wandering hunters. And so what he's doing is he's taking the Christian message and he's putting it in a new language so that people can see it and understand it. And so he was this missionary from France, and he lived in one of these villages, and he eventually persuaded many Huron people to come and become Christian. And here's where the story kind of turns tragic, which is that the Iroquois were another tribe that lived in that area, were another nation that lived in that area. And in 1649, they invaded Huronia, so the Huron people, the Huron country. And they had been enemies of the Huron for centuries, and they had battled back and forth. And they would have a battle, and the Iroquois would come in and burn down a Huron village, and the Huron would go and burn down an Iroquois village. And often what they would do is after they had burned down the village and killed some of the men, they would adopt some of the women and children, such that even though there was all this kind of fighting going on, the two nations were kind of mixed. But the arrival of the Europeans made the kind of battles and the struggle that had gone on between these two nations much worse, because before they would have been fighting with arrows and bows and clubs and sticks, but now they were fighting with guns. And they were fighting not just, but they were fighting to control the valuable fur trade. And there was a lot of, not money, but valuable gifts and goods from the Europeans that they wanted to control. And the Iroquois were allied with the English colonies, which were down in New York, so kind of in what's today the United States. So anyways, the Iroquois, they had this invasion, and it was extraordinarily successful from their point of view. And what they did is they killed thousands of Huron people. They adopted some of the ones, the children and that sort of thing, into their own tribe. And then they forced the rest to flee, that means run away, into the wild. And so this budding kind of Christian Huron community was all mostly killed. And Brebeuf himself was martyred. And you can skip this next 15 seconds if you don't want to hear something kind of crazy. The way that they martyred him is that they burned him alive after pouring boiling water on top of him. And the reason they did it was because they kind of thought that it would be a good way to kind of mock the ceremony of baptism. And the stories that we hear about Brebeuf that were passed down from people who kind of escaped were that he accepted the entire thing with kind of an almost amazing amount of kind of courage, such that after he was killed, some of the Iroquois warriors, they drank his blood and ate his heart in order to kind of imbibe some of that courage, as was their tradition. So, we look back on that now and we think, oh my gosh, what a crazy different kind of world it was. But I tell you this story for two reasons. One, because I want to show you that indeed it was a different world. That time in history is only about, 450 odd years ago, maybe a little more than that. But it still, no, a little less than that, excuse me, about 400 years ago. But it still is so different than what our lives are like today. And then the other thing I want to point out, though, is that there is a seed planted in the story of Jean de Brebeuf of some of the things that make Canada, I think, a good country, in that there is this ability of people to learn about different cultures and to try and learn to live together. In the same way that there's something good about Canada when we think about les filles du roi, that our country has become a place where people all over the world have come in order, if they're poor or if they're in trouble, to make a life for themselves. So those are two things that I think you could notice in New France, even though it wasn't a perfect place by any means, that kind of connect to Canada today. Well, what was going on further down? So there were 14 British or English colonies on the Atlantic coast from Nova Scotia. Now, Nova Scotia means New Scotland, and so it's up in what is today Canada. And it was British. And then you would go further down. So there were about 13 other colonies, things like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and New York and Virginia and South Carolina and Georgia, New Jersey. All these places are English colonies that have set up on the East Coast, on the Atlantic coast of what is today the United States, and then Nova Scotia, obviously, in Canada. And the colonists were mostly Protestants. So they were Christians who were not Catholic. And almost everyone spoke English. Now, the economy was based on farming. There was fur trading too, but farming was more important. And it was much bigger than the economy of New France. Like New England, all of these British colonies in the New World were much, much more important than the New French colony was. And there were large cities like Boston and New York, and those cities were much, much bigger than Quebec would have been. In fact, let's look at this chart here. And I'm just going to give you a minute to take a look more closely at it. So it's got the year and then the population of New France, and then the year and the population of the 13 American colonies. So if you look at 1628, there's 76 people that live in New France and about 2,000 that live in the United States. By 1713, there's just shy of around 18,000, or a little more than 18,000 in New France, 434,600 that live in the United States, what's now the United States. And then by 1760, there's 70,000 in New France. So the population in New France is growing for sure. But the United States, what's now the United States, is more than 2.2 million people. So 70,000, 2.2 million, that means that there were roughly 30 times as many people living in the British colonies than there were living in the French colonies. And when you think of that, you can think, in the long run, how well are those 70,000 plucky French people going to be able to stand up to 2.2 million British people? Because as we'll see in a minute, these sets of colonies in the British Empire and the French Empire are always, always, always fighting. One thing I want to mention, and it's important, even though it's terrible and tragic and evil, was the slave trade. So taking human beings and forcing them to work as slaves for no pay, stealing them from their communities and their families, was a very important part of life in the British colonies, especially in the South. Now, slavery as an institution, taking people away from their families, has been part of human history for a very long time, and it's been part of every society and every culture. There were slaves in Rome, there were slaves in Greece, there were slaves in ancient China, there were slaves in ancient Japan, there were slaves in the Pacific Northwestern and native tribes. Like there was slaves many places, and it had mostly gone out of fashion in Europe in the Middle Ages. But then, when the Europeans went to the what they called the New World, it came back into fashion, and they started kidnapping people from Africa. And what would happen is an African chief would kind of defeat another chief and then take the entire tribe and sell them to the British or to the French or to whomever. And the Europeans would take those Africans across the ocean to their colonies in the New World, and they would use them on these plantations. And a plantation is just a farm, and they would use them, and these people were not treated well. They were beaten, they were hit, they were whipped. And the worst thing is that they just didn't have the freedom. They couldn't stay back at home in Africa. They were taken across the ocean and then forced to work without any freedom. So the slave trade was a very important part of life in those British colonies. There was some slavery in New France, but there was much less than there was in the British colonies in the South. And the reason for that is that Canada is a harder place to grow a lot of food, or to grow a lot of cotton. And the crops that we grow up here are harder to grow, and so you don't want to have as many people around that you have to feed. Whereas in the southern United States, the crops could grow much longer. It's warmer, so you wanted more manpower around, and so that's one of the reasons they brought so many slaves to what's now the United States. Another really terrible aspect of life in North America at this time and across the Americas was smallpox. And this is an image of a family grieving because we've talked about how Indigenous people did not have immunity to some of these European diseases, and smallpox was one of them. And so at this time that the Europeans are starting to set up their colonies in New England and New France and New Spain, disease is just running wild through Native communities. And because different Native people would trade with other Native people, this disease would spread way before any white people showed up. And in fairness, many of the Europeans didn't really know what was happening and what they were doing. Today we know a lot more about diseases than we did at that point. And I think a lot of the time they spread the disease unknowingly. And they would catch smallpox, and smallpox was deadly to a European, but it was much more deadly to a Native person because it was new to them. It was new to their body and new to their internal kind of workings. And so as a result, they weren't able to fight it off as well as the Europeans might have been. And so we think about how we're currently in this COVID pandemic, and we're all doing these things where we're having to self-isolate. But imagine doing that in a time where you didn't know nearly as much about medicine. You didn't know nearly as much about how things spread for a disease that was absolutely terrible. Now, I was thinking I should show you an image of what smallpox does to the human body, but if you don't want to see it, because it's kind of graphic, you can skip ahead about the next 10 seconds, 15 seconds perhaps. So this is a girl from India in the 1970s, and she had smallpox, and I think luckily she was able to survive because she was able to be treated. And today, we have eliminated smallpox from the face of the earth. So they've been able to create vaccines and create drugs to kind of cure it. So we've been able to eliminate this terrible disease. But this is what it would do to somebody. It would cover them in these terrible sores all over their body. And their body would try and fight it off, and sometimes they would die of a fever. So here's some notes to fill in. Smallpox was a terrible disease that killed huge numbers of indigenous people. Indigenous people were not immune to the disease because it had only existed in Asia, Europe, and Africa beforehand. They had never had the disease before, so their bodies were not good at fighting it off. Smallpox weakened many indigenous nations, and it made it hard for them to resist European settlement on their lands. So one thing we can often think about is like, why didn't the native people just say, hey, we don't want these Europeans living here, setting up their farms and their cities and all this jazz. Why not just fight them back? At first, they were pretty weak, right? Like the Europeans. And that's a fair question to think about. But I think one thing that we need to remember is that a lot of these native communities had been devastated by this terrible, terrible disease. So they were having their own problems, and they maybe, had a harder time fighting off the Europeans than they would have otherwise. Another reason for that is the Europeans had some tools that meant that they were able to do kind of incredible things in war. One of the tools the Europeans had at this time was guns. And their guns were not amazing. They took a long time to reload, but they were much stronger, louder, and more effective than a bow and arrow or a spear. And so here's an image of Samuel de Champlain fighting with the Huron against the Iroquois. And in this, battle here, he shoots his gun a few times, and it scares off the other tribe because they don't know what this is. So the Europeans had these guns and had these weapons that they were able to use. And over that entire period, in the 1600s and 1700s, the British and the French, they struggled for this control of the fur trade because the fur trade was so valuable and it was so desirable in Europe to have these furs that they wanted to control it themselves. They didn't want the French to control it if they were British, and they didn't want the British to control it if they were French. And they also wanted to expand their settlements, expand their towns and their villages and their farms. And more people were coming over from Europe. More and more people, the population was just naturally expanding too from people having children. And so they needed to expand their settlements. They needed new farms, they needed more towns and all that sorts of things. And as they did this, they would make alliances with various indigenous peoples, and they would fight with them and against them to control this trade and this territory. And an alliance is basically a deal that says, I will be your friend if you will be mine. And as we talked about earlier, the French alliance was at first with the Huron, and the British was with the Iroquois. And those two nations had these really crazy wars, which were made even crazier on the basis that the French and the British were supporting the different sides. So here's an image of one time that the British are just outside of Quebec City. This is in 1690, and they're about to try and attack Quebec City, and they're trying to get the French to surrender before they attack. And at this time, the governor of Quebec says, under no circumstances will we surrender. And the French actually win this time. They're able to stop the British from taking over Quebec. So I'm going to show you this quick little video.
Move along, all of you! Make way for the envoy!
October 8th, an envoy comes ashore with an ultimatum of surrender for Governor Frontenac.
It's been a long time since I've seen the enemy this close. Tell me, Caporal, Lieutenant, oui, Lieutenant, about your Colonel Schnips. General Phipps! Ah, Phipps, oui. Is he still such an idiot? Oh God, monsieur! Does he really think he can conquer Quebec with only 2 or 3 ships? Monsieur, we have 34 ships and a full regiment from Boston. Frontenac has 1 hour to surrender. You terrify me, Caporal. Wait! Enough! Arrêtez! Well, Governor Frontenac, your reply, sir. I will reply from the mouth of my cannon.
The Americans pressed the attack, but Frontenac beat them off. Phipps weighed anchor and never returned.
Move along, all of you!
So I love that little story because so you've got these French people who are outnumbered crazily by the British in North America. And Governor Frontenac, so he's the guy in charge of Quebec at this time, he says, they say, do you want to surrender? And he says back, you will hear my surrender. You will take my response from the mouth of my cannon, which is basically him saying, heck no, I'm not going to surrender. And the French, in this case, actually beat back the British in 1690. And the British had kept attacking Quebec, and there kept being fights back and forth. But unfortunately, from the French perspective, there was one final decisive battle. And that battle is this one, in this painting here, this famous painting, in the year 1759. Now, in the year 1759, the British attacked Quebec again after what is called the 7 Years' War. And it was a war in Europe, it was a war in North America, it was a war in the French colonies and the British colonies in Asia as well. And this is the attack that happened in September of 1759 on the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, which is basically a farm outside of Quebec City. And a British general named James Wolfe commanded the British, and a French general named the Marquis de Montcalm commanded the French. And I'm going to show you kind of a clip here. It's a longer one, but it's kind of good to give you an image of what this battle would have been like. So settle in and enjoy this clip.
It is 9:30. The real battle has not yet begun. For 30 minutes, the British artillery pummels the French line to create disorder while the army is still forming on the hill. Montcalm decides he will not wait for Bougainville's reinforcements. He will strike at the British this morning. He rides to his artillery commander, Montbéliard.
I spoke for a moment with Monsieur le Marquis de Montcalm, who told me we will not be able to avoid the battle. If we give them enough time to establish themselves, we will never be able to attack with the kind of army we have.
Montcalm orders a general advance. At approximately 10 o'clock, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham begins. It is a textbook maneuver. Montcalm's army will advance in a massive column. It will sweep down the hill and smash the thin red line. But the French line that started down the hill is uncoordinated, and after a short distance, the first mistake. Someone gives the order to halt the advance and fire.
Apprêtez vos armes! En joue!
The ragged volley is pointless. The British are far out of range. The French resume the advance, their lines more confused and disordered with every step. Wolfe's soldiers wait. When the French are within 40 yards of the British, they form for their second volley. This time they can see the faces of the men in the British line.
Now, I gotta say, if you're squeamish and you don't want to see some images of the battle really heating up, this is a time to pause and to skip ahead. But if you're interested in seeing kind of how the battle turns out, watch on.
As the French reload, the British take position to fire. Finally, in the smoke and confusion, James Wolfe issues the most important military command of his life. The British volley is devastating. A mile-wide burst of concentrated fire. The French line is dazed, but stands its ground. Then the Highlanders unleash an advance with broadswords that can slice a man in half. Joseph Trahan of the Acadian militia is right in front of them.
I can remember the Scotch Highlanders flying wildly after us, with streaming plaids, bonnets, and large swords, like so many infuriated demons.
As the wall of British bayonets draws closer, confusion finally crumbles the French line. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham has lasted barely 15 minutes. Sometime just after the British volley, James Wolfe is struck by a fatal shot in the chest. At the crest of the hill, Montcalm is engulfed in a stream of retreating men. Sometime in the next few moments, he is struck by a musket ball below his ribs. Most of the French flee up the hill towards the walls of Quebec. With them, Joseph Trahan.
I was amongst the fugitives and received in the calf of the leg a spent bullet, which stretched me on the ground. I thought it was all over for me, but presently I rose up and continued to run.
The British are within reach of the gates of Quebec, with the Highlanders leading the charge. Until they are stunned by a barrage of fire from the surrounding woods and fields. Hundreds of Canadian militia and Indians cover the retreating French army. first wounded are brought to the General Hospital and to Marie de la Visitation.
We were in the midst of the dead, the dying, which were brought to us by hundreds. Many of them are friends, our relations. It was necessary to smother our grief and extend ourselves to relieve them.
Even though the French vastly outnumber the British, Vaudreuil has decided they will not fight again the next day. He orders the soldiers to abandon Quebec and to
So that video shows you basically kind of a reenactment. So that's not like an actual video of that happening, but that's a reenactment of the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And that was the crucial battle where the British finally beat the French in Canada. And later, at the end of the war, there was a deal, a treaty signed between the British and the French. And in that treaty, what the French king said was, you know what? We don't even want Quebec back. You take Quebec, because there was one little Caribbean island that they wanted, and that Caribbean island was Martinique. And I think they wanted it because it was producing a lot more money for the French than all of Canada was, because sugar, which grows on those plantations in the Caribbean, is often quite a bit more valuable than the furs. And also, you didn't have quite as many people to fight off in Martinique as you did up here in Canada. So that was the end of New France. It wasn't the end of the French in Canada. Today, one of our 2 official languages is French. About a fourth, 1 in 4 Canadians, they speak French as their first language. Quebec is one of our most important, our second biggest province, and one of our most important parts of the country. And the French have gone on to make a really important part of our history. But it was the end of the French really being in charge. Now the British, the English, would control Canada's future. I'll close here with this famous image of, this is James Wolfe. He's the British general who was the British general who commanded the British at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And he died shortly thereafter by getting shot by accident during that battle. And it's interesting what the painter has chosen to do here, which is he's got James Wolfe right in the center, and he has this image of this Indigenous man just kind of observing what's going on and not really playing a giant part in it. And for the British and the French, as they got more and more powerful, and then the British, as they got more and more powerful, they began to see the Indigenous more and more that way as well. And so the British beat the French. They took over New France. The population there was still all French, so it would take a long time before there were a lot of English speakers in Canada. And the population was also quite heavily Indigenous, still in the many parts of the continent that the British and the French didn't control. But more and more, the British would see themselves as the ones that had this destiny of taking over the continent, of taking over North America, of taking over all of what became Canada. So in the next lesson, we are going to talk about what the British did once they controlled Canada and what happened in the American Revolution, where things changed radically for them. Until then, have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.